All right, so now that we've adjusted our server so that it takes into account multiple different types of socket connections that our application might want, the next thing that we're going to do is go into our all notes connection and define what we want this onConnect function to be. So just like we did a note detail connection, we're going to define this separately. And this is just going to be an asynchronous function that gets called when a client first connects, via a given WebSocket connection type. So what this is going to look like, let's go into our socket event handlers, and we're going to create a new file that's going to be similar to handle note detail connection, except it's going to be called, you might have guessed, handle all notes connection.js. All right, now what this thing is going to look like, I mentioned that it's going to be an asynchronous function. We're going to say export const handle, handle all notes connection. And this is going to be async, and it's going to take the socket that's currently trying to connect as an argument. Okay, so that will allow us to send events to the socket, to find out information about the socket, etc. The other thing that we're going to need to do, we're going to need to import both the notes DB and the users DB, because what we're going to want to do inside this handle all notes connection is load all of a user's notes from the database and send that data through the socket to that user. So we're going to need both of these databases for that. And we're going to say from ... /db. Cool. So the first thing we're going to do is get the user from the socket. Now, since we have this load auth user from token middleware added to our all notes connection, we don't really need to do that explicitly. All we need to do is say const auth user equals socket.user. And then what we're going to do is we're going to load the user from the users DB by saying const user equals await users DB dot find one, and we want to find the user whose ID matches the auth user's ID. That'll be UID rather, auth user.uid. And once we've done that, we're going to want to get all of the notes that the user owns. And this is going to look like that. We're going to say const owned notes equals await. And since the user object, remember, contains an array of the IDs of the notes that they own, we're going to want to populate those with the corresponding note. So the way we do that is by saying await promise.all user.notes.map. And we're going to map each note ID to notesdb.findOne. And we want to find the note with that ID. Now, if you're feeling a little bit of deja vu here, then there's a reason for that. And that is, if you take a look at the list notes route, you can see that we're doing something very similar, right? We're getting the auth user from the request, right? Just like we're getting the auth user from the socket in our handle all notes connection. And then we're loading that user and we're populating their notes. Now, you might be wondering why we're not doing this if statement thing here, where we're checking if the auth user's ID equals the user ID in the request parameter. And that's just because we're no longer using a parameter like this, right? We're just getting the auth user's ID and we're using that to directly load the user's notes. And there's not really an advantage one way or the other. The way that we defined it as an endpoint was really just to make it a little more restful. Anyway, I wanted to point that out, and as you might guess, a lot of the logic that we're about to write in handle all notes connection is going to be similar to what we had here, with a few key differences, obviously, taking into account that we're working with WebSockets now instead of network requests. So the next thing that we're going to do here is we're going to get all of the notes that have been shared with the user. So to do that, it's going to look like this. We're going to say const shared with user notes equals await notesdb dot find, and we want to find all of the notes that have this user's ID in their shared with property. So that's going to look like this. We're going to say shared with, and we're going to say, just like we did in our list notes route, $LM match email auth user dot email. Oh, I mistakenly said ID with this. We're actually storing the user's email that it's shared with to make things easier for ourselves. Forgot about that little detail. Cool, so now that we have the shared with user notes and the owned notes, what we're going to do next, oh, and by the way, you're going to want to call .toArray on this one here. What we're going to do next is we're going to send back these owned notes and shared with user notes to the client. And instead of saying request.json to do that, we're going to say socket.emit, and we're going to emit an event which we'll call initial notes. All right, that's, again, we're just able to define whatever name we want, whatever name makes sense for these kinds of events. And for the data, we're going to have both the owned notes and the shared notes by saying owned. That's going to be owned notes. And for shared, we're going to have shared with user notes, but we're going to want to format both of these notes so that we have the correct permissions set on them. So what we're going to do is we're going to import the format shared note function that we defined earlier. You might remember this. It just adds a role property to each of the notes. And we're going to use that by going down here and saying format shared note. Oh, and actually this should be shared with user notes.map. And we're going to say map note. Here's where we say format shared note. And for that, we'll say note. And we're going to pass through our user as well. All right. And that should be all we need to do. All right, so this again is going to load all of the owned and shared notes from the database and send them back to whatever socket just connected to the server via the WebSocket connection. Okay, so as you can guess, on the front end, we're going to need to listen for this event once we get all of that logic in place. And now that we have this function created, let's just go into our all notes connection and replace this empty function with our handle all notes connection function that we just created. And that should be all we need to do so far on the backend. So the next thing that we're going to see is how to actually connect to the backend from our front end and load those initial notes. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.